Good afternoon. My name is Rohini Bhattacharya. I'm the head of Apprenticeship Services for Pearson. And the Contractual Processes webinar today is going to continue on from the webinar we did late November, which some of you may or may not have attended. So just to jumpstart our webinar, I will just quickly run through some of a quick recap on what we discussed in the webinar end of November, just to rejig everybody's memories. So in November, we talked about the conditions for EPA organizations that have been imposed by the Education and Skills Funding Agency, i.e. some conditions that all EPA organizations need to follow if they are on the register as an EPA organization. So as per these conditions, all the providers, yourselves, need to record on the ILR the endpoint assessment organization which has been chosen by yourselves or the providers who would be doing the assessment for your apprentices. The ESFA are also asking for details of which employers have chosen their respective EPA organizations from us as an EPA organization. So apart from the fact that the providers are filling in their ILR, the ESFA has put in an additional checks and balance from their end to actually make sure that the employers who are choosing us, we are aware of that, and that's what is being fed in to their ILR by the provider network as well. And they've also specified a time period for that. So they, as soon as we know which employer has chosen us, they want those details from us within 4 working weeks after that selection. The ESFA on their part have also mentioned that they would check the ILR details which have been entered in so they can fill in the gaps. And where a provider has chosen an EPA organization, which is probably the majority of the case at the moment, the conditions document also specified that the EPA organization should meet with the employers directly to discuss and confirm the EPA arrangements. And we'll talk about that in the subsequent webinars that we will be carrying out over the next few weeks. So as per these conditions, what do the conditions actually say? So the conditions stipulate that there needs to be a form of contract in place between the provider and the EPA organization as soon as the employer has selected the EPA organization. Now, we do have an existing process which is in operation, which is called the letter of intent. However, the intent is not a legally binding contract, and the stipulation within the ESFA conditions around having a contractual agreement with the provider is primarily from the perspective of having a commercial arrangement. So at the moment, the ESFA conditions, the ESFs do not allow the payment directly to an EPA organization, and hence it's been routed through the provider systems, and hence we need to have a legally binding document which stipulates that the employer is actually paying the EPA organization via the training provider, and that's what needs to be detailed within the contractual agreement. So what I've got there is a list of what the contractual agreement needs to detail, i.e. roles and responsibilities of the provider, the EPA organization, the schedule for channeling of funding from the employer to the EPA, and some of the terms specifying that the EPA organization is actually delivering on behalf of the employer, with the provider acting as the ESFA agent. I'll quickly pause there. I'm just reminded of the fact that I haven't mentioned how I'm going to interact with yourselves. So if you do have any questions, please use the question chat box on the GoToWebinar software, and please type in your questions. I will pause through the webinar to take some questions, which will be put forward by my colleague Sapna here. And in case we do not have answers readily available for you at this stage, we'll definitely do a response after the webinar, and that will go out to yourselves as well. So in terms of looking at how we are now going to engage in the contractual processes, if you or your employer has chosen Pearson as an EPA organization, what I've got there is a very brief process map, which is slightly amended from the earlier version that we had shared. So in the orange pink boxes are the training providers or the FE colleges. In the blue boxes is Pearson. So the process starts with the training provider or the FE college having signed a contract with the employer for X number of apprentices. Once you've signed that contract with the employer, you can request your letter of intent from the Pearson account manager if you are a Pearson center. If you're not a Pearson center, please do email us or get in touch with myself through the register details, and I can point you to an appropriate colleague to create that letter of intent. Once you've got the letter of intent in place, that gives us visibility as an EPA organization to understand the timelines for the EPA, the estimated EPA date. So when does the apprentice actually pass the gateway and the approximate EPA date that they would be taking the EPA. The Pearson account manager would complete that letter of intent and send it to yourself. 6 weeks after that letter of intent has been signed, we recommend that the account manager also completes an EPA services contract with yourself. And following that services contract signing, the account manager would then schedule an EPA planning meeting with yourself, the employer potentially, and we are stipulating that that should happen typically 8 weeks from the contract signing stage, and a minimum of at least 6 months prior to the estimated EPA date. Now, beyond that 6 month stage, and that's fine because we're just starting this process now. If you have a letter of intent, your account manager or the dedicated Pearson account manager in touch with you shortly, because all of this information has been passed on to them. If you do not hear from them, by to actually get in touch with them, because the most important thing for ourselves is to make sure that we have visibility of your apprentices and the estimated dates that they would be in the endpoint assessment. So moving on to what our EPA services agreement actually details. So we need to have a contract signed with providers, and that is going to be one contract per employer. So if you are being inundated by a number of employers, that's fantastic. But unfortunately, you'll have to sign one contract per employer. So if you're working with 10 different employers, that is 10 different contracts for yourself as a single provider. Electronic signatures are fine. We've gone past all of that. So, we'll be able to take electronic signatures. All of that signing process can happen electronically. It does not need to have a physical face-to-face meeting. However, if you do want a face-to-face meeting for clarifications, absolutely fine to schedule that as well. The signatory should be and must be a senior staff member within your organization who has that authority, and we would be asking for those details when we send the contract electronically to yourself. As I mentioned, the account managers will send through the contracts electronically, and they would agree a time frame for the return and the finalization of that contract, or discussing any clarifications that you might have prior to signing that contract. We will have most of the information that needs to go into the contractual agreements through our letters of intent. So again, the account managers will actually pre-populate those details before they actually send out the contracts to your dedicated person. You must have, as a provider, you must have a contract signed with an employer before you sign the contract with Pearson. That's absolutely essential that that's in place. There are some complexities around the new standards, as we all know. So not everything within the contract is straightforward, and there might be some discussion points that are required. So I've detailed down here what those discussion points would typically be. The first is around the number of reassessments applicable per standard and the prices for these. So Pearson as an organization has taken a position that we will be charging for the reassessments. The number of reassessments can typically be either detailed within the assessment plan. And I've taken an example here. So take an example of the customer services practitioner EPA. That particular standard has 3 elements to the endpoint assessment. There's an apprentice showcase, a practical workplace observation, and then there is a professional discussion. I will go on to the details around the reassessment. So in terms of the applicability of the reassessments, from Pearson's perspective, the reassessments apply at the modular level. So for example, if all the 3 elements again have failed to show the appropriate level of evidence that's required for them to pass that observation. So an apprentice, for example, can pass the showcase, fail the observation, pass the professional discussion. So it'll only be the observation bit, which is the second discussion point would be around the payment terms. And I've put that under review because while we have got a position at this stage, it might change in the near future, especially to make sure that we're not creating a logistical nightmare by defining payment terms which are not easy to follow either by yourself or the employer. So at this stage, our position is that we will charge 10% of the EPA price at the time of booking on Pearson systems. And the remaining 90% would be charged on completion of the first attempt on the system. So essentially, we complete all the 3 elements of the customer services EPA. And when the assessor actually keys in the results on our system, irrespective of the results, the 90% payment would be triggered for you as a customer. This is whether the apprentice would pass the EPA or not. That first attempt payment would be triggered. Reassessments under the payment terms are paid in full at the time of booking. So for example, if that particular apprentice who failed the observation bit now gets a reassessment date fixed for that observation, at the time of booking that reassessment, the full payment would be triggered. The third discussion point would be around the key personnel that are involved in the management and the administration of the EPA service. So we know from our end that we have a number of people that would be involved within that administration service, and that is actually detailed as a named person within our contract as well. From your perspective as a provider, I would suggest that you probably think of at least 2 people to be named on the contract. One person who would be having that overall responsibility for the apprenticeship service. However, if you have more than 10 apprentices in an organization, I would suggest that you have an administrative person as well, because there is a lot of paperwork to be keeping on top of. There's a lot of logistical details that you need to keep on top of as well. So ideally 2 people. Entirely up to you. It's not set in stone. We're not recommended. We're enforcing that you need, but ideally 2 people would be best in order to be specified within that contract. From Pearson's perspective, we would have a named account manager who would be our usual contact person from Pearson for everything related to all of our products and services. We would also name a specific apprenticeship services manager as well, who would be dedicated to your account. And again, we've detailed out the specific roles and responsibilities that each of these people will be responsible for within the contract, so you can have a read through that. And the third person from our end who would be involved would be the endpoint assessment delivery manager. So again, we've detailed out what this person would do, and the EPA delivery manager would be primarily around the assessor allocation, the marking, grading, and certification process, whereas the apprenticeship services manager would be more around all the logistical details, so getting in touch with you around arranging specific details for access requirements, assessor details, or details of the EPA endpoint components that need to be delivered. So we've separated out the roles and responsibilities each of those people would be doing from our end. reassessment, it probably needs a more detailed discussion. So probably best to go through a few points, and I'm sure you'll have more questions than what I will address here. So that's probably a subject of more detailed conversations with your account managers. We would probably need to explain and agree the number of reassessments and prices that are applicable for each of the specific standards. The approach that we are taking in terms of defining or determining the number of reassessments is in that order of hierarchy that you can see on the screen. So firstly, if it is detailed in terms of what number of reassessments are allowed within the assessment plan, then that's the rule that we follow. However, what we do see is that the assessment plans do not necessarily detail it at each of the component levels. So they might be quite vague about a number of reassessments for one particular component, have a detail for another one, and there is no rule as to how they actually define that. It's based on what the employer trailblazer group decides at that point. So the second level then, if it's not in so much detail, is that we will go by the employer's preference. They might have a particular reason, rationale for having a certain number specified, so we will have that discussion with them. And the third hierarchy is our own policy. So we have come up with a reassessment policy, which we are keeping under regular review, because the EPA and the new standards landscape is still a very evolving landscape. So as and when the market conditions change, we do review our policies and see if it's still fit for purpose, or do we need to change that. And of course, we will come out with those discussions and with that information and communication as and when we do change it. Again, going back to the example of the customer services practitioner. So in terms of that particular standard and the application of the reassessment numbers, as I mentioned, there are three elements, or three components as we call them, within the customer services standard: the showcase, the practical observation, and the professional discussion. The assessment plan, as it currently stands for the customer services practitioner, allows reassessments. It just says that reassessments are allowed. It does not specify the number that's allowed, the number of reassessments that's allowed. So we have had instances from our first pilot delivery of this particular EPA, wherein the employer has expressed a certain preference for a certain number of assessment attempts. And these can be due to a variety of reasons. So for example, within an NHS trust, as an example, there might be some health and safety issues which are absolutely basic minimum, and hence, because of those reasons, the employer would say, I would want to restrict it to one reassessment, because if they can't do it the second time round, then I don't think this person is fit. There might be some workplace specific standards. So there might be an organizational requirement that as a basic minimum, this person has to do 1, 2, 3 things. So I would want that if they don't pass that element the second time round, or even the first time round, then I would want the reassessment numbers to be capped at X or Y. So again, it's a case of having the discussion with an employer. While the assessment plan does not specify the number, we will be more than happy to discuss our policy and our rationale for imposing our Pearson policy for reassessments. And if the employer and the provider think that's absolutely fine and they can follow that, then we will, of course, follow that in terms of the implementation of the reassessment policy. The Pearson policy for reassessments is that we allow 2 resubmissions per component. So for each of those 3 components for the customer services practitioner, the apprentice would be allowed 2 retakes or resubmissions or recaps. We also have specified there is a grade cap on the second resubmission. So if an apprentice, unfortunately, has to go all the way up to the second resubmission, the only maximum grade that he or she would be allowed would be a pass at that stage. So that's where we have, and our rationale for coming up with that is based on essentially the learner-centric view. So giving every opportunity for the apprentice or the learner to actually showcase their evidence of competence, and then making sure that we are providing that consistent opportunity for all apprentices across different sectors for the same standard to demonstrate their occupational competence. So I'm just taking an example of how our policy would be applicable in practice. Again, going back to that example of the customer services practitioner. If the apprentice fails to evidence all the past criteria, so when we have a customer services practitioner specification, the specification would detail out all of the past criteria for each of the components. It will also detail out all of the distinction criteria for each of the components. And if the feedback from the independent endpoint assessor after, let's say, the showcase element suggests that the apprentice has not evidenced all of the past criteria, then we will firstly agree a resubmission date. And the resubmission of the showcase that the apprentice undertakes would be to showcase the gaps in evidence from the first time round. So the apprentice showcase element it's quite an involved process in terms of what the apprentice needs to demonstrate in terms of their occupational competence for that particular component. And we do recommend within the specification, they spend a considerable amount of time to actually collate that evidence together. So we understand that the apprentice might have managed to pass maybe 9 out of 10 criteria. However, the pass criteria is set at 10 out of 10. So if that is the criteria that it is set at, then we would encourage the resubmission to focus on that one criteria which has not been met. So that feedback, that detailed feedback, would be given to the apprentice at that stage. Oops. Okay, the arrows come forward. So resubmission of the apprentice showcase would be allowed. To retakes of the practical observation and the professional discussion each would be allowed as well. So slightly different terminology is being used for the different components, retakes and resubmissions. But essentially, there is two additional opportunities after the first sitting for the apprentice to actually demonstrate their occupational competence at the component level. There will be a grade capping that would be applicable. So I've done a small table here. It can be a bit confusing, but essentially the aggregation rules. So for example, how does the apprentice get a distinction at the overall EPA would be determined by what percentage of the showcase, the observation, and the professional discussion aggregate up to the final grade. So if it's 20%, 20%, and 60%, then they can fail at the professional discussion. But if the professional discussion aggregates is weighted at 60%, then that is absolutely critical for them to get that right. On the top of my head, I don't remember what the weightage is, but the specification is where that level of detail is available. So what this table is just showcasing is essentially the grade capping at the third attempt, i.e. the second resubmission. So for the first and the second attempt, the apprentice has access to all of the grades allowed as per the assessment plan, i.e. pass and distinction. But at the third attempt, we would cap the grade that is available for each of those elements at just the pass level. Continuing with that example, I've talked about the grade aggregation. So in terms of what I talked about before, the apprentice can bank the achievement at the component level and carry it forward for aggregation. So for example, in the showcase, professional discussion, and the observation, they can bank that they have got a distinction at the first attempt, and they will only do the resubmission at the component level. So essentially what they achieve at the first attempt would be carried forward in terms of arriving at their final grade, irrespective of the number of attempts that they take. And again, I mentioned the weightage of each component is what determines the final grade that's applicable. So in terms of, again, continuing with that example, how would the reassessment pricing work? So our EPA price for customer services practitioner is £500 per apprentice. The reassessment prices for each of the components is as you see on the screen. So essentially, each of the components, depending on the time that is used to actually carry out that assessment, is the pricing is apportioned by each of those elements. And what the employer pays for in terms of the reassessment would be just for that particular component. Going quickly over to the payment terms. As I mentioned, 10% of the EPA price is payable at the time of booking the apprentice on our systems, and we have stipulated within the contract that the EPAs must be booked at least 2 months prior to the estimated EPA date. And then the remaining 90% of the EPA price would be payable on the completion of the first attempt. So irrespective of the result, once all the component results have been entered onto the system, that would trigger the 90%. And as mentioned again, the reassessments would be payable in full at the time of booking. We are setting up these payment terms on our system. We know that our first EPAs are not due till May of this year, so we would be well in time before then to have our system set up for these payment conditions to be applicable. We have kept that under review. We have kept our payment terms under review simply because we are finalizing some of the things such as a refund policy. So for example, if a provider or an employer actually books the endpoint assessment for an apprentice 8 months before the estimated EPA date, and then apprentice actually decides to leave the job and go somewhere else 3 months before they're due to take their EPA, what happens? Do they get a refund? Do they not get a refund? If they do get a refund, how much are we willing to refund them, et cetera, et cetera. So all that policy is being detailed out now. What happens if the apprentice withdraws or if the apprentice actually does not bother to show up on the date of their assessment? So we need to consider all of those, which are at the moment under progress in being finalized, and hence we want to make our payment terms as easy as possible from an administrative perspective, and hence we reserve the right to change that payment terms. But of course, we would give all of you suitable notice in advance, and that would also be reflected within the contract variation when we come to that. I'll just pause there very quickly to see if someone has any questions that I need to take.
Yes, we have a number of questions. So the first one, the first question is, when will this all go electronic or letter of intent, and via what system?
So I'm assuming that the letter of intent going electronic has to do with the fact that you can receive a letter of intent electronically. You can still do that now. So, your account manager can email you the letter of intent for you to put an electronic signature. In terms of if you're referring to an automated process, this letter of intent process is very specific to Pearson. It's not something that's been stipulated. We have stipulated that so that we have sufficient notice to be ready and have visibility of that endpoint assessment date. But in terms of walking through that process for the providers, our systems would be doing that very soon. We would have that functionality very soon. So yes, there's nothing that prevents you from having that electronic letter of intent process already in place. So do get in touch with your account manager if you don't understand that process yet. If you're not a Pearson Center, then please do email me or look out on our website for contact details, and we can get in touch with you to run through that process.
Okay, and we have one more question. What is the timeline for notification to provider of pass or fail?
Again, that depends on the SLA, so our service level agreement. At the moment, we are specifying that as 7 days from the date that the assessment was carried out, and that's to enable us to make sure that we have quality assured our grading and results before we give it out to the apprentice and the employer.
Another one's just come in. Can interim assessment still take place? And is there a particular weighting or percentage of activity which must be included within the EPA?
Interim assessment. I'm not sure what's meant by that term. If that refers to mock assessments, then yes, that can be carried out, but obviously that does not count towards the endpoint assessment. Sorry, can you repeat, Sapnata, can you repeat the question again? So I'm sure I'm answering it correctly.
Okay, so the first question was, can interim assessment still take place? And the second part of the question is there a particular weighting or percentage of activity which must be included within the EPA?
Okay. Interim assessment can take place. However, I'm just trying to get my head around the context of this. Any interim assessment will not count towards the results or the grade for the endpoint assessment. The endpoint assessment is purely a synoptic assessment. There are elements of that synoptic assessment that the apprentice needs to start working on before the gateway stage. So, but that's very specific to each individual standard. So, for example, I know that within the hospitality standards, they need to do a project, they need to do a portfolio of evidence, which they can start collating much before they actually reach the gateway stage. However, the actual assessment of that portfolio would be done only at the time of the endpoint assessment by the independent assessment organization. In terms of the specific activity and how much that aggregates up to the endpoint assessment, again, that's very, very specific to each individual standard. So I know that there are, for example, the property maintenance operative standard level 2 has an element wherein there is a particular percentage of activity that is completed at the on-program stage, which then adds up into the EPA grade. But those are very far and few. The majority of these standards have activities that the apprentice needs to start collating, but then the actual assessment of that activity would be done by the independent assessor. Again, I would just mention it here. Our subsequent webinars that we'll be carrying out would actually detail all these specific things, especially the one in March that's due in March. We would take a couple of examples of specific standards in terms of the kind of information and the kind of walkthrough we would be doing with yourself, with the employer, to detail all of these processes in more detail.
We have a couple more questions. Who receives the results of each EPA component? The apprentice, the employer, or the provider?
Yeah, it's a very good question. We can be flexible on how we process that information. So again, that's part of our touchpoint activity that we will undertake with yourself. If you, the employer or the line manager, or all of you want to receive that result rather than the apprentice, we are happy to share that with you. For you to then download it or pass it on to the apprentice. The apprentice would obviously receive a feedback from the assessor. The employer and the line manager is also more than welcome to receive that feedback from us as an EPA organization. For each component, Pearson would print what we are calling an evidence of achievement. So the whole new standards frameworks, the whole new standards landscape, the awarding organization or the EPA organization is no longer allowed to print a certificate, because it's only the ESFA that is allowed to actually provide that certificate. So instead, what we will provide is, it looks like a certificate, but it's not called a certificate. It's called an evidence of achievement. And the apprentice would receive that for each of the components of the endpoint assessment, as well as for the overall EPA as well.
One final question. How long would the waiting time be for reassessment from booking?
Okay, again, very good question. Again, this is very specific to each standard. So some standards, for example, I think the healthcare support worker stipulates that the endpoint assessment, including all the reassessments, should be completed within 3 months after the gateway. However, some other healthcare standards I know stipulate that you have almost 12 months from the first attempt to complete all the reassessment. So it really varies from standard to standard. And again, that's the level of detail that we would need to capture through those touchpoint activities in preparation for the EPA.
that's it for questions for now.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Sapna. So moving on to the services contract and the rollout process, what happens next? So in terms of the contract rollout processes, if you have an existing letter of intent with Pearson, then your account manager will get in touch with you shortly to discuss your EPA services contract. The contract will be sent out electronically, populated with as much detail as we have. That's already completed by the account managers. Please do read the contract thoroughly. It is a legally binding document. You need to understand what you're signing up to and what you need to do to comply with the contract. If you do have any clarifications or questions, please do get in touch with your account manager. There is a wider team that's supporting the account manager to take your complicated questions as well. As I mentioned through the presentation, the reassessments, grade capping, all of those details would need explanation, ideally with the employer, so they have the understanding of the implications of that. And we're happy to schedule time to discuss this in more detail with you as a provider or the employer as well. And again, I'll just reiterate that the providers must have a contract signed with the employer prior to signing the contract with Pearson. If you do not have a letter of intent with Pearson and you do have apprentices that you want Pearson to EPA for, then please do get in touch with your account manager if you have one, or please do email us and we will get in touch with you, or a colleague of mine will get in touch with you to explain and go through that process. So what happens next? Once you've signed the EPA service contract, what happens next? So in terms of next steps, I've mentioned this briefly. We are introducing what we are calling the countdown to EPA service. What that involves is a series of regular touch points at 6, 4, 3, 2, and 1 month prior to the estimated EPA date. Those touch points are very, very specific to each standard that Pearson is offering an EPA service for. And some of the questions that you've asked are some of the details that we would be touching upon at those touch points on a regular basis. The countdown service is also contextualized to the apprentices organization's job role and situation. So we know, and we're also already getting questions around the applicability of a customer services practitioner as an example within a healthcare setting or within a services contract, so for example in a call center. So I think the context of the apprentices organization and their specific job role within their organization is very different, and that also determines how the delivery of the endpoint assessment and the expectations around the endpoint assessment would work specifically for that particular organization. So all those details are being captured within that regular touchpoint processes. Again, we'll be setting down expectations as an EPA organization around how we expect the readiness for gateway to work, what our expectations are around the evidence requirements for the gateway stage as well. So there are more details which are coming in the next 2 webinars, which I'll just highlight there on the screen for you. So our Getting Ready for EPA webinar is scheduled for next Friday between 12 and 1. And the Pearson EPA service, which will give you a full rundown on what our EPA service proposition looks like, is scheduled for the 9th of March between 12:30 and 1:30. And please do make sure that you have time available and set aside for those. Thank you very much for listening, and hope you have very good weekends.